It was a little after 0700 hours when the sniper candidates assembled at the Fort Benning Advanced Marksmanship Unit. Staff Sergeant Brandon Cole stood at the firing line, his voice carrying across the range with absolute confidence. He liked being the authority, and the new candidates gave him that. Today, the rhythm shifted when he mentioned a civilian safety observer would be joining their qualification shoot. The candidates traded glances as an older man appeared from the observation tower, carrying a weathered paperback book and a thermos of coffee. Daniel Caldwell moved slowly, gray hair catching the morning light, wearing faded jeans and a plain brown jacket. Cole's smirk widened. He asked if the old man needed directions to the visitor center, suggesting this was a restricted training area. The laughter rippled through the group. Dan didn't respond. His eyes moved across the range, reading wind flags at multiple distances, noting mirage patterns rising from the heated ground. His weight was centered, shoulders relaxed, the kind of posture that came from decades of absolute stillness. 200 yards away in the tower, Colonel Frank Mitchell watched through binoculars. He knew that stance. It wasn't how civilians observed. Welcome to Secrets Never Told. Before we dive into this story of shattered assumptions, perfect precision, and the moment when modern arrogance met timeless mastery on a Georgia firing range, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from today. And if you believe that the deadliest shots are taken by those who never brag about them, hit that subscribe button. These are the stories that remind us technology can't replace experience. It was close to 8:30 hours when Cole gathered the candidates around the main observation post. The morning sun was already heating the air, creating visible mirage waves that would complicate any long-range shot. The smell of gun oil, hot brass, and Georgia pine filled the air. The range stretched out before them, 1,000 yards of carefully maintained grass with steel targets positioned at various distances, each one marked with range markers and windage flags. The primary challenge today was the 1,200-yard position, a distance where even experienced snipers struggled with consistency. Cole strutted like a man performing for judges, his voice carrying authority as he explained they were using the most advanced equipment the Army had to offer: Kestrel weather meters, ballistic computers, the latest optics with built-in ranging system. His confidence was absolute, his faith in technology unshakable. Daniel Caldwell sat quietly on a wooden bench near the tower stairs, his book open on his lap, occasionally sipping from his thermos. His expression was calm, but his eyes tracked every flag movement, every shift in the mirage, reading the range the way some men read newspapers. Cole turned toward him, his tone patronizing, speaking slowly as if to someone hard of hearing. He explained they were demonstrating modern precision marksmanship, probably a bit technical for someone used to paperwork and safety checklists. The candidates chuckled on cue, their confidence fed by their instructor's arrogance, never suspecting they were sitting next to a legend. He called for Lieutenant Marcus Webb to take the first shot at 1,200 yards. Webb was Cole's star student, 26 years old, sharp, technically proficient. He moved to the firing position with practiced efficiency, settling behind a Barrett M82A1, its massive frame supported by a bipod. He pulled out his Kestrel meter, checking wind speed, temperature, humidity, barometric pressure, punched the data into his ballistic computer, adjusted his scope's elevation and windage turrets with mechanical precision. The entire process took 4 minutes. When Webb finally settled into position and squeezed the trigger, the report echoed across the range. Through the spotting scope, they watched the impact, 8 inches right of center, off the steel plate entirely, hitting dirt. Webb frowned, checked his data, adjusted, fired again. 6 inches left this time, still a miss. Cole's jaw tightened slightly, but he covered it with instructor voice, explaining that 1,200 yards was extremely challenging, that even small environmental changes could affect the shot. The candidates nodded, accepting this as normal. Then a quiet voice came from the bench. Dan had closed his book. He was looking at the range, not at the people. Winds shifting every 30 seconds, 3 different speeds between here and target. Your computer can't read that. The words were soft, almost conversational, but they cut through the morning air like a blade. Cole turned, his expression darkening. "Excuse me?" "The flags," Dan continued, still not looking at anyone directly. 200 yards out, you've got 8 miles per hour left to right. At 600, it drops to 5. At the target, it's back up to 10 with gusts to 12. Your meter only reads here. Computer assumes constant conditions. That's why you're missing. Webb bristled. "With all due respect, sir, I don't think you understand how ballistic computers work. They factor in." "I understand they can't see what I can see," Dan said simply. Cole's face reddened. "And what exactly can you see that our equipment can't?" Dan stood slowly, setting his book and thermos on the bench with care. The wind, the statement hung in the air. Cole crossed his arm. Is that right? And I suppose you think you could do better? I know I could. The confidence in Dan's voice wasn't arrogance. It was fact stated plainly. Cole's smirk returned. Tell you what, old man, you take one shot at that 1,200-yard plate. Just one. You hit it dead center, I'll admit maybe there's something to your observation skills. You miss. You pack up your coffee and paperback and let the professionals work. Dan looked at him for a long moment. One shot? One shot. Moving target? Webb laughed out loud. The target's stationary. Then it's not a real test, Dan said quietly. Anyone can hit steel that's not moving. Make it challenging. Cole's eyes narrowed. We don't have moving targets set up at 1,200. Dan gestured toward the range vehicle, a Humvee positioned near the 800-yard line for safety observations. Drive that out to 1,200. Have someone hold a man-sized silhouette out the passenger window. 5 miles per hour. That's a walking pace. Real-world conditions. The suggestion was absurd. The candidates shifted uncomfortably. Webb shook his head, muttering about old men and fantasy. But Cole saw an opportunity, a chance to humble this civilian who thought reading flags made him a sniper. Done, Cole said. But I'm adding a condition. You don't use any of our equipment. No ballistic computer, no Kestrel, no laser rangefinder. You claim you can read the wind. Prove it. Old school. Dan nodded slowly. Fair enough. I'll need a rifle. Something simple. Webb, give him your M24. Webb looked shocked. Sarge, that's my personal. Give it to him. Webb reluctantly handed over his rifle, a Remington 700 in .308, wearing a loopholed scope, a solid platform, but nothing compared to the Barrett. Dan accepted it, checked the chamber, worked the bolt smoothly, examined the scope's adjustments. His movements were efficient, practiced, the hands of someone who'd done this 10,000 times. Cole radioed the range safety vehicle. Within minutes, the Humvee rolled out toward the 1,200-yard marker, a range officer holding a full-size IPSC silhouette target out the passenger window. The vehicle began moving perpendicular to the firing line at a steady 5 miles per hour. The target swayed slightly with the vehicle's movement and the wind. It was a shot that would challenge even the best military snipers. Dan walked to the firing position, knelt behind the rifle, and settled into a stable position. He didn't rush, didn't pull out any technology. He just looked downrange, watching. The candidates gathered behind him, some curious, most skeptical, all waiting for the miss that would end this sideshow. For 90 seconds, Dan simply observed. His eyes moved from flag to flag, starting with the nearest at 200 yards, rippling steadily left to right, consistent movement, then tracking to the 400-yard marker where the flag hung more limply, indicating a wind shadow from the tree line to the north. At 600 yards, the flag snapped intermittently, showing gusty conditions in that middle zone. At 800, it went limp again, and at the target distance of 1,200 yards, the flag danced erratically, full-strength wind with no obstacles to break it. He watched the mirage rising from the heated ground. At 400 yards, it boiled straight up, no wind there. At 800, it tilted visibly left to right. Near the target, it streamed horizontally, confirming what the flags showed. He was building a mental map of the wind, seeing it as a three-dimensional river flowing through the air with currents and eddies that no computer could predict. He watched the Humvee's movement, exactly 5 miles per hour, steady pace. The target swayed not just from the vehicle's motion, but from the wind pushing against it. He calculated lead time, how far ahead of the target he'd need to aim to account for the bullet's flight time. At 1,200 yards, even a .308 traveling at 2,600 feet per second would take roughly 1.5 seconds to reach the target. In that time, the target would move approximately 11 feet. Add the wind, and the bullet would be pushed several more feet right. But these weren't calculations done with a calculator. They were assessments born from 40 years of doing exactly this, in conditions far worse than a Georgia training range. He'd made shots like this in Vietnam with humidity so thick you could barely see the target. In deserts where heat mirage made everything shimmer and dance. In mountains where winds swirled in impossible patterns. This was just another shot. Difficult, yes, but not impossible. Then he made his adjustments. 5 clicks up on the elevation turret, each click representing a quarter minute of angle, moving the impact point roughly 3 inches at this distance. 3 clicks right on the windage. His hands moved with absolute certainty. No hesitation, no second guessing. The confidence of someone who'd done this calculation thousands of times and knew it was correct. He chambered a round. The bolt slid forward with a solid metallic click that seemed loud in the silence. Brass gleaming. The round seated firmly in the chamber. He closed the bolt, feeling it lock with that final, satisfying resistance that told him everything was aligned. Settled his cheek against the stock shock, the familiar pressure, the wood worn smooth by decades of use, fitting his face like it had been custom made. His right hand found the grip naturally, finger resting along the receiver, not yet on the trigger. His left hand supported the forestock, elbow planted firmly on the ground, building a stable platform from bone and muscle and experience. Controlled his breathing, in through the nose, slow and deep, out through the mouth, even slower, letting his heart rate drop, letting the world narrow to just him, the rifle, and the target. Everything else, the watching candidates, Cole's skepticism, Mitchell's binoculars, the pressure of the moment, all of it faded until there was only the shot. His crosshairs found the target, not on the target, ahead of it, leading the movement by exactly the distance he'd calculated. The target moved through his scope picture from right to left. He waited, breathing. The crosshairs settled into rhythm with his heartbeat, rising and falling slightly with each pulse. He timed it, let half his breath out and held it. Between heartbeats, when the crosshairs were perfectly still, when the target would be in exactly the right position, when wind and bullet and movement would all align for one brief perfect moment, his finger moved to the trigger, not pulling, not jerking, just increasing pressure with absolute smoothness, the way a sculptor adds the final touch to marble, gradual and inevitable, until the sear released and the rifle fired. The shot cracked across the rain. Through the spotting scope, they watched the target 1,200 yards away. The silhouette jerked as the round punched through dead center mass, exactly where the heart would be on a human target. The Humvee kept moving, the target kept swaying, but there was now a perfect hole exactly where it needed to be. For 3 full seconds, no one spoke. Webb's mouth hung open. Cole's arms dropped to his sides. The candidates stared downrange as if they'd witnessed something impossible. Dan worked the bolt, ejecting the spent brass, and engaged the safety. He stood slowly, handed the rifle back to Webb with the same care he'd received it, and walked back to his bench, picked up his book, poured more coffee, sat down as if nothing had happened. The silence stretched until Colonel Mitchell's voice came over the range radio, calm but carrying weight. "All personnel hold position. I'm coming down." Within 2 minutes, Mitchell emerged from the tower, his boots crunching on gravel as he crossed to the observation post. The candidates snapped to attention instinctively. Cole straightened, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. Mitchell stopped directly in front of Dan, who remained seated, still holding his book. "On your feet, Marine." Dan stood slowly, his posture subtly shifting, not to attention exactly, but to something that carried 35 years of discipline. Mitchell turned to address the gathered candidates, his voice carrying across the range with absolute authority. "What you just witnessed was not luck. It was not some trick. It was mastery built over decades. The man you've been laughing at is Master Gunnery Sergeant Daniel Caldwell, United States Marine Corps, retired, scout sniper, instructor, legend." He paused, letting that sink in. Master Guns Caldwell served from 1970 to 2005. He was personally trained by Gunnery Sergeant Carlos Hathcock, the most famous sniper in Marine Corps history. Caldwell went on to train 3 generations of Marine Scout snipers. His record includes multiple confirmed kills at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards, several in combat conditions far worse than what you just saw. Cole's face had gone pale. Webb was staring at Dan with something between awe and horror. Mitchell continued, "The book Master Guns is reading, he wrote it. Advanced Field Craft and Wind Reading for Precision Marksmen. It's currently the recommended text at the Marine Scout Sniper School. The man you dismissed as a civilian safety observer has forgotten more about long-range shooting than most of you will ever learn." Mitchell turned back to Dan, came to attention, and rendered a slow, formal salute. Dan returned it with the same precision, the gesture of one professional to another, not of rank anymore, but of respect earned through a lifetime of excellence. "It's an honor to have you on my range, Master Gunn." Dan nodded, his expression still calm. "Thank you, Colonel. Good to see standards are still being maintained here." Mitchell turned back to the candidates. "Let me be clear. The technology Sergeant Cole showed you today is valuable. Ballistic computers, weather meters, advanced optics, these tools have their place. But they are tools, not replacements for skill. Master Guns Caldwell just proved that all your equipment means nothing if you can't read what's actually happening downrange. That's not obsolete knowledge. That's fundamental craft." No one moved. The morning sun climbed higher, heat beginning to radiate from the ground in waves. Somewhere a flag snapped in the changing wind. The candidates were dismissed at 1100 hours, their faces drawn, their earlier energy completely drained. The confidence that had filled the range that morning had been replaced by a silence that felt like weight. Daniel Caldwell remained on the bench, his book open again, reading as if the morning had been entirely routine. He cleared Webb's M24 by the book, removed the magazine, opened the bolt, visually and physically checked the chamber, then handed it back with the same care he'd shown before. Every motion was deliberate deliberate, respectful, professional. As he returned to his seat, movement caught his attention. Lieutenant Marcus Webb stepped forward, standing at rigid attention. His voice shook as he tried to speak, shame and realization warring in his expression. He wanted to apologize, to explain, but the words wouldn't come properly. His throat was tight, his eyes fixed on the ground. Dan studied him for a long moment, his weathered face showing neither anger nor satisfaction. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried across the now silent range with perfect clarity. "The equipment doesn't make you a sniper, Lieutenant. It helps, but it doesn't replace knowing how to read the world around you. That comes from time, from patience, from respecting what came before you built your career on it." Then he closed his book, picked up his thermos, and walked past Webb toward the parking area, leaving those words hanging in the morning heat. Over the following weeks, the atmosphere on the range transformed completely. Webb was the first to change. He stopped relying solely on his ballistic computer and started spending hours just watching the flags, studying mirage patterns, learning to read what technology couldn't measure. He requested copies of Dan's book and read it cover to cover 3 times, taking notes in the margins. He began arriving at the range before dawn, observing how conditions changed through the day, how wind patterns shifted with temperature. His shots improved dramatically. Other candidates noticed. Without being told, they began following Webb's lead. The arrogance that had defined their training disappeared, replaced by careful observation and patient practice. They started asking Cole different questions, not about equipment settings, but about reading environmental condition, about how snipers operated before computers existed. Cole himself began to shift. The humiliation of that morning had cut deep, but rather than becoming defensive, he recognized it as a lesson he'd needed. He reached out to Colonel Mitchell and requested that Dan be invited back as a guest instructor. 3 weeks later, Dan returned. He didn't lecture. He sat on the same bench with his coffee and book, and when candidates approached with questions, he answered simply, demonstrating on the range rather than explaining in classroom. He showed them how to read mirage, how to judge wind at multiple distances simultaneously, how to estimate range without technology by understanding terrain. The transformation in the candidates was profound. Several months later, Dan received a call from Colonel Mitchell. The Fort Benning Advanced Marksmanship Unit was being formally redesignated. The new name, the Caldwell Range for Precision Marksmanship. A dedication ceremony was planned. Dan tried to decline, saying his name wasn't important. Mitchell insisted, telling him that what he'd done that morning had changed how they trained snipers, that his example had become a permanent part of their culture. The ceremony was small and professional. A bronze plaque was mounted at the range entrance, Caldwell Range, dedicated to Master Gunnery Sergeant Daniel Caldwell, USMC, return. One shot, no excuses. ISTE 2024. Dan stood quietly as they unveiled it, his expression unreadable. When Mitchell asked if he wanted to say anything, Dan simply shook his head. The silence was more powerful than any speech. But before he left that day, he pulled Lieutenant Webb aside, reached into his jacket and removed something, a worn challenge coin, Marine Scout sniper insignia on one side, Hathcock's motto on the other. One shot, one kill. Carlos Hathcock gave this to me in 1972, Dan said quietly. After my first successful stalk, he told me it wasn't about the shot. It was about everything that came before it. The patience, the observation, the discipline to wait for the perfect moment. He pressed the coin into Webb's hand. You've learned that now. Pass it forward when you find someone who understands. Webb's hand closed around the coin, his eyes burning. He came to attention and saluted. Dan returned it, then walked to his truck without another word. Years passed after that morning on the range. The story didn't fade like most base legends. It grew, becoming part of the culture, spreading through Fort Benning and beyond to every military sniper school in the country. Instructors began calling it the Caldwell Standard, mentioned whenever technology became a crutch, when shooters forgot that equipment was just a tool, not a replacement for skill. The term appeared in training doctrine, in safety briefings, in the quiet conversations between veterans and students. The Caldwell Standard meant one thing: master the fundamentals before you trust the technology. On the wall inside the Fort Benning Sniper School Operations Center, there was a photograph pulled from range security footage. It showed Dan kneeling behind Webb's rifle, his form absolutely perfect, the kind of position that couldn't be faked or rushed. Beneath the image, a simple line had been engraved on brass. 1,200 yards, moving target, first round hit, Master Guns Daniel Caldwell, 90 seconds. No one ever tried to remove it. New candidates stopped to study it before every qualification shoot. Some nodded silently, others said nothing at all. But all of them understood what it represented. The event became part of the school's identity. New students arriving for sniper training were told about it during their first orientation. They learned about the civilian observer who'd been mocked, who'd accepted an impossible challenge, and who'd delivered a perfect shot using nothing but experience experience and observation. It wasn't told as a story of humiliation. It was told as a reminder of what true mastery looked like. Marcus Webb carried that legacy more than anyone. He completed sniper school at the top of his class, went on to serve with distinction, and eventually became an instructor himself. He never bragged about his abilities. He didn't need to. His authority came from competence, not volume. When students asked about his teaching philosophy, he would simply say, "Read the wind before you trust the machine." Those who knew the story understood exactly what he meant. Webb often returned to the Caldwell range on quiet mornings. The facility had expanded, adding more positions, more technology, more capability. But the bronze plaque near the entrance remained, its surface worn smooth by countless hands touching it before heading to the firing line. Sometimes Webb brought new instructors there and told them the story. He didn't talk about embarrassment anymore. He talked about transformation, about how one lesson, delivered in silence, could change an entire program. Years later, a new class of sniper candidates stood at the Fort Benning range. Their instructor, a lean captain who had once trained under Lieutenant Webb, waited until all conversations stopped. He began the session not with equipment checks or ballistics charts, but with a story. He told them about the civilian with the paperback book and the thermos of coffee, wearing jeans and a jacket, looking like someone's grandfather. He described how that man had been dismissed by soldiers who didn't yet understand what professionalism meant. And then he described the shot. 1,200 yards, moving target, first round, perfect center mass, using nothing but eyes and experience. By the time he described the moment when a colonel had saluted a retired Marine, the range was completely silent. The captain gestured to the bronze plaque. Master Guns Caldwell proved something that day. Technology is valuable, but it can't replace knowing how to read wind, how to judge distance, how to understand the 1,000 invisible factors that affect every shot. That knowledge comes from time, from patience, from respecting the craft. The candidates absorbed every word, their postures shifting unconsciously. By then, Daniel Caldwell had long since returned to his quiet civilian life. His book continued to be assigned reading at every military sniper school. His name was spoken with reverence in communities where precision marksmanship mattered. But the man himself remained invisible, the way he'd always preferred. The true measure of his legacy wasn't the plaque on the wall or the range that bore his name. It was the change he'd left behind in how snipers approached their craft. It lived in their patience, their observation skills, in the quiet way they read conditions before trusting computers. That was how the military remembered him, not with ceremony, but with competence, the same way he'd taught them. And in the stillness before every long-range shot across countless ranges, his lesson echoed: master the fundamentals, respect the craft, and prove yourself when it matters most. Have you ever underestimated someone based on age or appearance? Ever witnessed quiet mastery destroy loud confidence? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. At Secrets Never Told, we believe that true professionals don't need to announce themselves. They prove themselves when everyone's watching. And sometimes, the deadliest person on the range is the one nobody takes seriously.